Alright guys, we are talking now about cellular respiration. And cell respiration happens in all living things. Not just heterotrophs, not just autotrophs, all living things. So if you are living, you undergo cell respiration, and it happens like this in all living things. It's also pretty good evidence for evolution when we get to that later on. Basically, we're taking the sugar that we created either in photosynthesis, or if we're a heterotroph, we just kind of ate it. We didn't have to undergo photosynthesis. We're taking in some oxygen. In the process, we're releasing some waste carbon dioxide, some water, and we're making what we really want, which is the molecule of energy. Okay, so a lot of ATP produced here if oxygen is present. Then we have a lot. Okay, we still have a little bit of ATP produced if there's no oxygen, but hopefully we want aerobic cell respiration so we can produce maximum ATP. Okay, so cell respiration happens here in the mitochondria. Okay, nice organelle right here. This is essentially what you need to know. All right, there's an outer membrane, of course. It is a membrane-bound organelle. And then we have the inner membrane, and this is where all the ATP synthesis happens, is on this inner membrane. And then we have this fluid inside called the matrix. Okay, you don't need to know the words cristae. No big deal. What you need to know is this membrane is very important for ATP synthesis. And then also we have the matrix, which kind of aids in proton pumping. All right, so we'll look at that in a minute. All right, what we have here is the process of glycolysis, okay, happening first. Notice how it happens outside the mitochondria. So when we talk about this, okay, we're going to just be looking at glycolysis first, and glycolysis just happens in the cytoplasm, okay, or cytosol, as you probably see it before. So glycolysis, we're starting with our sugar here, and glycolysis means to break apart. Okay, lysis means to break apart, and then glyco is referring to the sugar glucose. Okay, so we're starting with our C6H12O6. Okay, so here's our sugar molecule. And remember, we've got a bunch of carbons at every junction here. Okay, so glycolysis essentially is a series of chemical reactions that breaks glucose into 2 3-carbon sugars. Okay, so here's our 3-carbon sugars. Here's another one. And these are called pyruvate. Okay, so pyruvate is essentially just glucose broken down into 2 3-carbon sugars. Remember, these all have their hydrogen and oxygen on them. Okay, so I'm not going to draw them, but they do have oxygen and hydrogen stuck on here because they are carbohydrate. Okay, so the end product of glycolysis is pyruvate. What you also need to know is that we're creating here 2 ATP. Okay, so in the process of glycolysis, 2 ATP are created. Okay, from here, if we have oxygen, we're going to continue with aerobic cell respiration, and that's where we continue into the Krebs cycle. Okay, and the Krebs cycle is essentially just a cycle that's taking our pyruvate in. Okay, so here's our pyruvate. It needs the helper of a molecule called coenzyme A. Okay, and it's essentially just a helper enzyme that takes pyruvate and puts it into the Krebs cycle. Okay, so that's all you need to know. We've got this cycle of reactions. Okay, pyruvate comes in. Of course, it's a 3-carbon sugar, so it looks like this. It's going to be taken in by a couple of things that are just hanging out in the Krebs cycle that kind of stay in there. So it's going to join with another 3-carbon sugar that's already here. Okay, what that is going to produce is a 6-carbon sugar called citric acid. Okay, so the citric acid is produced, and essentially the citric acid is going to then cycle around, and at a few different points it's going to release carbon dioxide. So we're letting off this molecule as carbon dioxide, we're letting off this one as carbon dioxide, and we're letting off this one as carbon dioxide. Okay, all through the cycle. Okay, so for every pyruvate that comes in, we let off 3 carbon dioxide. Since glucose makes 2 pyruvate, we're letting off all 6 carbon dioxide. So now we know why the equation has 6 CO2. In this process, we're creating 2 ATP. Okay, and the reason why 2 ATP are produced is because for every pyruvate that comes in, 1 ATP is produced. But of course, we have to go through this twice. Okay, so there's 1 ATP produced per cycle, and there's 2 cycles. Okay, so we have a net total of 2 ATP in the Krebs cycle. Okay. Then of course we've got our electron transport chain. Okay, I'll write it out for you guys. Electron transport chain. Okay, and the other fancy word for this is oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so here we're going to input, I'm going to change this to red. Okay, we're going to input our NADHs produced, and we're going to input our FADH2 that are produced from the Krebs cycle. So mostly the Krebs cycle is just there to produce these electron carriers, just like photosynthesis. Okay, so inside of our mitochondria, okay, we have our membrane here. And then we've got our, let's see, I'll go ahead and label this for you. Inner membrane. Okay, and then down here we've got our matrix, which is just the liquidy part. Okay, and in here we've got inside. Okay, so I'm just going to label this. You might consider this like the cristae or whatever. So we've got these electron carriers. Their job is to send electrons, okay, through this electron transport chain. So these electrons are moving and shifting through a bunch of different proteins, okay, but they're moving around. And this flow, again, just like photosynthesis, is allowing protons to be pumped to the inside of the mitochondria. So we've got a bunch of protons up here, okay, and just like in photosynthesis, we've got this awesome enzyme here called ATP synthase. Okay, and these protons, because they don't like to be up here, are going to naturally find their way down here. And once again, this flow gives the ability of ADP and phosphate group to find each other. Okay, and we're synthesizing a ton of ATP. Okay, the reason why we need oxygen here is to hang out at inside the matrix. Okay, so we've got this oxygen. It's going to pick up these free electrons, and in the process, it's going to grab some hydrogen with it. Okay, so what we're doing here is releasing water. Okay, so we've accounted for what happens to the water. Okay, we took in the sugar at the beginning. This is why we need oxygen here. And then our carbon dioxide, of course, is released in the Krebs cycle. So aerobic respiration involves all 3 of these steps: glycolysis, okay. Krebs makes 2 ATP, and then electron transport chain in most organisms will create 34. Okay. So that gives us a total of 38 if you are prokaryotic. If you are eukaryotic, then you only create 36, okay? And the reason is because it takes 2 ATP, so minus 2 ATP, to go into the mitochondria. It takes some ATP to move the pyruvates into the mitochondria. Okay, and prokaryotic cells don't have a mitochondria, so they don't need to go through that step. So they produce 2 more ATP than eukaryotic cells do. It's kind of interesting there. So essentially, we've got glycolysis, okay, which is taking glucose and turning it to pyruvate. Okay, if there's oxygen available, Then we will go to Krebs, and then electron transport chain, and we have a lot of ATP, and everybody's happy. Okay, but if there's no oxygen available, then we kick into fermentation. And what you need to know about fermentation is we've got some weird stuff happening. So a lot of humans and other animals will produce lactic acid. Okay, if you are a bacteria, you might produce something like ethanol. Okay, this is important in fermenting, like wine and beer. Or we could even have some organisms that increase it a lot, that produce an increased amount of carbon dioxide. For example, yeast and things like that. Okay, so this would be bacteria, and this right here would be a lot of animals. Okay, so this is what you need to know about fermentation. Okay, if there's no oxygen present, that pyruvate will get converted into one of these three things. Okay, for us, lactic acid buildup is why we have muscle soreness when we work out and things like that, and I know you guys already know about that. But here there's not a lot of ATP. Okay, and they're essentially just doing this to create enough energy for survival. Okay, so if there's no oxygen, we still have to find some way to survive, and that's why fermentation happens. Okay.